Hello, Karsten. Falcherash. So, as the title promises, I am going to let you in on a secret today. The secret to being understood by every native speaker of Gaelic. No ifs, no buts. I hope you're ready. This is a big one. Speak English. Wait, what? Speak English? But this is a Gaelic lesson. How can I say that? Quite simply, because it's true. I have never met a single native Gaelic speaker who understands me better when I'm speaking Gaelic than English, or who I understand better when they're speaking Gaelic than them speaking English. Quite simply, that's the way it is. And this raises a very important point about the purpose of learning Gaelic and the nature of speaking it as a learner. So I want you to ask yourself, why am I learning Gaelic? Why do I want to speak it? Now, maybe the answer will be related to this saying that you can find across the internet and that is attributed to Nelson Mandela, but it's actually a misquote. When you speak to a man in a language that he understands, that goes to his head. But when you speak to him in his own language, that goes to his heart. What Mandela himself said isn't particularly relevant here, but the sentiment expressed in the misquote definitely is. Because we don't learn Gaelic to be understood by Gaelic speakers. We learn so that we can connect with them on a more emotional and personal level. So for example, if I'm holidaying in the Western Isles and I start chatting to locals in Gaelic while travelling on the bus, there's this immediate connection, this closeness that simply wouldn't happen if I had forced them to speak to me in my language instead of addressing them in theirs. So far, so philosophical. But what does this mean in practical terms for a learner? Well, there's a common ideology in language teaching that says it doesn't matter whether you make mistakes or not, just as long as those mistakes don't break understanding, as long as you're being understood. But does that really apply if being understood is better achieved by speaking in a different language altogether? Consider, for example, the vocative in Gaelic, which I discussed a few weeks back. You'll probably be understood if you don't use it, but will you make the same emotional connection? Will you be genuinely speaking their own language if you don't use it? Now, I've chosen the vocative as an example here deliberately. The Gaelic for Mary is Mary, and the Gaelic for James is Seamus. In the vocative, these are a Vari and a Hamish. Now, even if you've not come across these as Gaelic names before, you're likely familiar with the names Vari and Hamish in English and Scots. So why was it that the vocative forms were borrowed into English and not the standard form? As it turns out, this happens in many languages. I used to live in Corsica, where they have their own language, which is threatened by French language policies. Corsican has a vocative case too. For example, the name Domenico is Odume in the vocative. Now, there are Corsicans born into French-speaking families that are called, by birth, Dume and not Domenico. And this, as I said, is seen in other languages too. Linguists suggest that the reason for this is because the vocative form, as the form of address, as the form for talking to someone and not about them, well, the vocative is just seen as more personal by the native speaker. And if this is the case, well, speaking the language without using the vocative is going to feel less personal and more distant. And now you won't be speaking to their hearts. All that said though, I feel that while in theory it's okay to say that errors are acceptable if they don't interfere with understanding, but in practice that's something that's impossible to measure, because for me as a teacher, I'm accustomed to hearing common errors in the languages I teach, even more so in languages that I myself learned in my teenage years or in adulthood. I've been exposed to these errors and I'm aware of what people intend to say when they make them. But an average native speaker might not be. So how can I judge what a native speaker who doesn't communicate regularly with learners would actually understand? Here's an example for you. I was at a traditional session ceilidh where people would take turns to sing a song or play a tune. A woman, who was clearly a learner of Gaelic, got up, looking quite nervous, and said, "Ha mi a geari a hain." Now I understood immediately what she intended to say. Ha mi a geari shine. I want to sing. But the Benanteha, the MC, well, she didn't. She was a native speaker, but she wasn't a teacher. She looked flustered. She glanced around each way out of the corner of her eyes, trying to find out from the room somehow what the woman had actually meant. Eventually she clicked and she said, "Avel usse a giari shine." But the way she said usse rather than u showed me that she still wasn't quite sure that her interpretation was correct. The first woman hesitated for a bit, but then finally responded ha for yes. Everyone understood in the end, right? So, no big deal? Well, I wouldn't say so. I mean, there she was, having just plucked up the courage to stand up and put herself forward to do a turn and sing a Gaelic song in front of all these people. And now she was stuck in front of a whole room of people silently looking at her, and she just got more and more embarrassed. That's not fun, and it doesn't encourage you to use the language in the future. Listje, of course I'm not saying that you have to be perfect as a learner. That's never going to happen because we all make mistakes. God knows I made enough when I was starting out. I still make mistakes now. But there's a hell of a lot of middle ground between never make a mistake and mistakes don't matter. So really all we can do is do the best we can. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, but equally don't be afraid to recognise that they are mistakes and teach yourself to correct them. Caillou, I figure that's enough for today. Cheery and drasta.